What if the first ships over our skies did not come to conquer but to keep the peace? What if we, armed to the teeth, hearts pounding, looked up at guardians and mistook them for executioners? This is not the invasion story you think you know. This is the night the world held its breath, the morning we almost fired, and the moment a single constant, quiet as a heartbeat, patient as dawn, changed two civilizations forever. No one forgets where they were when the sky changed shape. Elena Park was in the overnight lab at the Johnson Space Center, refilling the cheap drip machine and pretending coffee could make mathematics merciful when the array printed the first impossible curve. It wasn't a new star or a lost satellite. It was a shadow that made data feel heavier, as though the numbers themselves knew to hush. North of Houston, cell towers hiccuped. Along the Gulf, boats sent static-sliced maydays about a shimmering bruise high above the clouds. In Colorado, NORAD flagged it as non-ballistic, non-terrestrial, non-compliant. The label felt like a prayer that couldn't decide between fear and science. The first footage arrived from a long-haul pilot over the Atlantic, a trembling rectangle of pixels, a contour in the high, thin air, matte and moonlit, gliding without contrails. It had no edges until your eyes decided it did. Airports held incoming flights. Stocks dipped, jarred by the speed at which a rumor can empty a room. The White House press secretary said the right words, calm, coordinated, measured, while a camera strobe caught the reflection of her hands shaking. Cable news turned maps into countdown clocks. Social feeds split into camps. It's them versus it's a weather anomaly versus it's a psyop versus a small, severely upvoted thread of math nerds arguing that the object was projecting a low-entropy field, like a refrigerator for the sky. By midnight, the object had multiplied, 3 more shapes at the Lagrange points where gravity balances like a coin on its edge. The astronomers called it elegant, the generals called it encirclement. Oil futures jittered. Preachers filled live streams. A comedian posted, "When you told me to get my life together, I didn't think you meant by Tuesday." From the Pacific came the first clean silhouette, a lens the size of a city block hanging over open water, so still the waves beneath it forgot how to crest. It had no seams, no scorch marks, no visible thrusters. A dozen nations pinged it with radar. It returned nothing and everything. A velvet refusal that 8 pings and gave back a perfect Gaussian shrug. The French likened it to a cathedral. The Pentagon called it a platform. Words do hard labor when our eyes don't have a category. Elena watched the live feeds with the rest of the world, but what kept her at her desk was not the shape. It was the whisper riding the radio noise, a modulation tucked inside background hiss. It looked like random drift unless you stretched the timeline and let patience do what brute force could not. The waveform repeated, not perfectly, not machine neat, but the way a human breath repeats under a lullaby. She printed the spectrum, grabbed a pen, and drew vertical lines at the peaks. Prime gaps emerged, stubborn and honest. She tried to be cautious. Maybe she was seeing faces in clouds, but the sequence held. Someone out there was tapping the glass with mathematics, the only language we admit when our flags get loud. She sent the chart up the chain with the subject line, non-random, possible intent. At dawn, the first object moved, not toward a city, not toward any prize a war planner would pick. It drifted to a point equidistant from 3 undersea cables like a careful guest who has read the house rules. Navies scrambled. Fighters roared. A destroyer cut across the wake to put steel between unknown and homeland, because that is what destroyers are for. 200 miles away, a boy in Fresno texted his mother, "If they are real, can I still go to practice?" She replied, "Yes, wear sunscreen." The official term for the mood among governments was heightened readiness. Unofficially, it was older, the mammal flinch, the ancestral math of teeth and shadows. Across church pews and message boards, in bunker briefings and barber chairs, the human brain did what it has always done with the inexplicable. It filled it with stories. Some ended in fire, others ended in redemption. None of them matched the quiet geometry hanging over our oceans. By afternoon, someone put the moment into a single photograph, a National Guard convoy passing a Little League field, a line of armored green bisecting kids in blue caps tossing a ball, both groups under the same pale lens in the sky. It won awards later. On that day, it won hearts. It said, "We are not ready, but we are still us." Elena stared at the second day's data until the numbers blurred. Beneath the primes, beneath the steady tapping of "we are trying," a subtler structure breathed, ratios that did not drift with solar wind, intervals that matched not the turn of any planet but the half-lives of isotopes that stitch stars to chemistry. She felt the old thrill of a child hearing for the first time that the multiplication table isn't an opinion. "Are you seeing this?" she messaged a colleague at JPL. "What am I supposed to be seeing?" he wrote back. "Not us," she typed, but not hostile. Outside, Houstonians stood on porches the way their grandparents watched hurricanes roll in, eyes on the horizon, one hand on a radio, the other on a casserole dish. In a bar near the Space Center, a talkative contractor announced to anyone listening, "Whatever they are, I guarantee you will name them badly." We did. We called them wardens, sentries, angels, parasites, mirrors, harbingers, peacekeepers, and, in one corner of the internet, sky Roombas. The nicknames were attempts to domesticate awe. We were house-breaking thunder. Night fell, the objects glowed, not with a light you could film, but with the feeling of something you would not bump into even in the dark. Under that glow, the world did not end. It merely waited. And in that waiting, we began to decide what kind of species we were going to be. They spoke first in the oldest language we share, pattern. At 04:12 UTC, every radio observatory listening at the right band heard the same phrase emerge from noise. It was not spoken, it was sculpted, silence arranged into ratios. A beat, a longer beat, a cluster whose distances mapped primes up to 97, then a pause long enough for an anxious species to interrupt. We did. AM talk thundered about codes and psyops. A dozen tech CEOs announced they were on it. A senator who hadn't read a math book since high school declared the sequence, obviously encryption. The ships, if ships is the word for a thing that does not sail so much as rearrange the sea, answered the interruption with gentleness. Light blossomed along their undersides in pulses too clean to be weather and too soft to be warning strobes. Airglow responded like a choir. Over Dakar, a fisherman filmed the sky writing calculus in steady cursive. In Kyoto, temple bells rang without hands. The patterns repeated at human comfort intervals. They were not trying to rush us. The hulls were not bristling with anything we recognized as weapons. No apertures, no turrets, no hungry mouths for missiles. When a JSDF patrol jet flew close enough to drink the contrail of its own courage, instruments recorded a temperature drop and an eerie hush, as if the object made its own winter. The jet's pilot later testified that he felt lighter and heavier at the same time, a phrase that made physicists reach for whiteboards and poets reach for pens. On screens, the vessels looked like architecture, void black but not dead. The surfaces behaved like a lake at midnight, matte but not dull. You had the sense that touching the hull would leave a fingerprint and a memory. Engineers sketched cross-sections and back-of-napkin guesses about field generators, mass reducers, boundary layers that invited gravity to reconsider its policy. The guesses were beautiful. They were also our fears wearing lab coats. Our projection habit is old. Show us a dark forest and we imagine wolves. Show us a blank face and we draw a scowl. Show us silence and we hear menace. History had trained us to expect the first visitor to come like Empire, sail-rigged with arrogance. So when they pulsed constants and stood away from every asset we valued, we read it like a boxer's feint. We primed radars and loaded interceptors. We told ourselves it was deterrence. It was autobiography. On cable news, graphics teams rendered hypothetical weapons. What if those panels are launched doors? What if the light pattern is a targeting matrix? What if the temperature drop is a kill envelope? A retired admiral calmly said the words that calm no one. We prepare for intent we cannot yet know. A pastor reminded viewers that angels in the Bible always start conversations by saying, "Fear not," and that the next line is almost always, "because you're about to see something that would terrify you." A comedian quipped that maybe the ships were just here to regulate parking. Elena and her small cohort of pattern zealots tried to reframe the question. Not what are they, but what are they trying to make universal? The light pulses when graphed on a sphere, produced a map not of our star field, but of pulsars, millisecond lighthouses whose timings are so regular they could keep time for a patient universe. The message, then, wasn't "we are here, but we know where you are because we know what you know." It was consent. Let's meet at common ground. At the UN, ambassadors wrangled acronyms. The phrase "rules of first contact" got stapled to competing draft resolutions. Words like proportionality, non-interference, mutual recognition walked around the chamber wearing fresh ink and old baggage. In neighborhoods, people did what people do when the world edges toward the unknown. They cooked for neighbors they hadn't met. They filled bathtubs. They checked on elderly tenants. They cracked dumb jokes to make all bearable. On the second day, a thing happened that 1,000 white papers had predicted, but no one believed would feel so human. The ships adjusted in a way that prioritized our gaze. They moved so that no single capital had a better angle. They lowered until their shadows sat on international waters, international air, international conscience. They were writing manners into their body language. We brought our own table. Everyone's invited. Fighters shadowed them. Destroyers drew invisible lines and dared the newcomers to cross. Ballistic subs hovered below like patient teeth. In group chats, old high school friends argued about show of force versus show of faith. In a living room in Atlanta, a mother told her son that fear can be a teacher if you let it talk and a tyrant if you let it drive. Every hour the pattern continued. Primes, pulsar timings, ratios of fundamental constants with tolerances so precise that metrology labs blushed. Then a new variation. The light on the belly of the North Atlantic vessel strobed a slow golden spiral, the same math that patterns sunflowers and hurricanes and the unfurling of a newborn's ear. It was not a flex. It was a handshake. We could have heard it as such. We didn't, not yet. Because in the quiet between pulses, something else was growing, a pressure produced not by their mass but by our imaginations. We felt cornered by etiquette we didn't write, judged by a presence that wouldn't say in words what its patience was saying in light. We called our senators. We checked our batteries. We watched the sky and waited for the move that would let us be right about our worst stories. The first human shot was not a shot exactly. It was a test. At 11:03 UTC, a missile cruiser in the North Atlantic fired a radar-guided paint at the nearest vessel, a nudge that says, "We see you, see if you can hide." It is the sort of push sailors have given strangers since sails first met on open water. The object responded by doing something that looked like a shrug. The local wind dropped, the sea flattened, and the radar return smeared into a bell curve so clean it could have taught statistics to freshmen. The cruiser logged it as interference. Headquarters logged it as resistance. The morning shows called it defiance. The second shot was closer to a shot. A hypersonic interceptor performed a high-altitude loop so near the Pacific object that if they had been two human strangers at a bar, someone would have said, "Hey, buddy, give the lady some space." The interceptor's guidance experienced a phantom command to throttle back. It complied, gently, as if a hand were set on a shoulder, not a throat. The pilot's heartbeat spiked, and at a speed where a tremor is a dissertation, his hand shook. He peeled away. On his dashcam you can hear him say, "They're not shooting, they are correcting." No human commander wants their assets corrected by a guest. The word sovereignty got heavier. In emergency meetings, men and women in crisp uniforms without a lot of sleep argued law and prudence and duty. In streets, people bought canned beans and asked each other which of their pre-apocalypse skills were marketable. A teenager in Manila posted, "If aliens don't kill us, the group projects will." The post was liked 2 million times. Markets stumbled. A rocket company offered to take the fight higher and was politely ignored. Conspiracy boards announced that the ships were museum pieces and the real invasion would come from underground. A historian wrote an op-ed reminding readers that civilizations often greet the unfamiliar with either a parade or a pogrom, and that adult nations learn the third option, a question. We didn't pick the third option immediately. We picked every option at once. A NATO carrier group postured. A regional power sailed its proudest destroyer close enough to tempt a collision. Somewhere quiet and desert flat, a test range punched a burst of microwave energy into the sky, the kind of pulse that makes drones forget whose team they are on. It washed over the nearest object and came back as this was the phrase that circulated like a rumor inside a rumor. Nothing to chew on. Engineers shrugged. If you build a wall for teeth, you measure your success in splinters. The objects began their first obviously defensive maneuvers. Defensive, but to human eyes not gentle. When a submarine rose directly beneath the Atlantic vessel, the water above it thickened as if time had a viscosity. The sub's hatch sensors recorded pressure that did not match depth. No one was injured, no hulls buckled. The sea simply said, "Not there." To the crew inside the sub, it felt like a god cupped the ocean with one palm. Above, to cameras starved for drama, it looked like the aliens had swatted a threat the way a teacher removes a thumbtack from a chair. Cable news replayed the moment 1,000 times. Each loop tightened throats. In parliaments and congresses, the word preemption acquired an odor like ozone before lightning. "We cannot afford to be reactive," said one lawmaker, who meant we cannot afford to be surprised by the unknown. A general, eyes red, said softly, "Deterrence is a story two sides tell together." The other side had not yet spoken in words, and our half of the story was turning into a pep talk with a trigger. Crowds formed, some to pray, some to party, some to watch. In Lagos, a DJ threw a block wide set under a sky that pulsed mathematics, and 100 phones filmed the beat match primes to base. In Warsaw, veterans in dusty medals saluted the ship as if it were a monument to every fallen they had buried. In Sao Paulo, a protest claimed that we were cowards for not firing. In Austin, a protest claimed we were fools for thinking a bullet knows how to translate. Both groups loved their children. Both groups looked up and asked the same question: what happens next? What happened next was the closest we came to ending ourselves out of habit. At 1847 UTC, a battery near a coastal city lit up its launch rails. The crews had trained for decades for wars that never came. They were sober, competent, and like all professionals, convinced that readiness is a form of love. The target packages did not name city centers. They named coordinates over water, high enough to be symbolic and low enough to be seen. The missiles rose, straight as an oath. Families on rooftops watched white spears tear clean seams in the evening. Children clapped before their mothers told them not to. The first missile approached the Atlantic object. Every lens, every radar, every beating human heart waited for an explosion that would turn the water into a bowl of boiling glass. Instead, the missile became unimportant, not destroyed, not diverted by a brute force you could measure in craters. Unimportant, its guidance logic demoted its own mission as if embarrassed by the melodrama. Telemetry later read like the journal of a soldier who decided not to die for a mistake. The missile arced into a self-preserving path and fell to the sea with the dignity of a bird changing its mind. Two more followed. Two more became humble. Naval aviators who had flown through flak and fire swore at their screens and then swore to their grandchildren that this was the first time they had seen a weapon become an afterthought. The objects pulsed light, faster now, urgent the way a mother's humming tightens when a child reaches for a hot stove. Around the world, there are rooms where the temperature drops when men and women decide history. In one of those rooms, a civilian who had slept 3 hours in 2 days said, "We are being handled." A uniform replied, "We are being spared." Another said, "We have to know which one." The answer arrived not as a threat, but as a theorem. It began very Americanly, with a whiteboard and a pot of coffee that should have been a controlled substance. Elena and a small team, cryptographers, astrophysicists, a linguist who loved Bach, a coder who loved silence, stacked the pulses on top of each other until a lattice emerged. The primes were scaffolding, the pulsar map was coordinates, the golden spiral was framing. Inside the frame, a new pattern breathed, ratios of Planck units to atomic transitions, then to the half-life of carbon-14, then to the Schumann resonances that hum in Earth's sky like a planet-sized drum. It was as if they were pointing to us through everything that makes us measurable. The next layer was the constant Elena had felt in her bones on night one, a modulation in the noise that matched the statistical signature of infant-directed speech across species. The linguist, eyes wet, whispered, "They're baby-talking a civilization." The coder transformed the amplitude into a two-dimensional field. Then three. The field coalesced into a spool that rotated at a rate that mapped to the precession of our planet's axis. It wasn't a picture. It was a gesture. We know your wobble. We've come to steady, not to still. At precisely the hour the world most wanted a voice. Light on the Atlantic hull resolved into lines you could follow with a finger. A story told without nouns, an embryo, a nest, a storm, a shield held between the nest and the storm, not a sword, a shield. The UN chamber went quiet enough to hear the click of pens. In bunkers, generals did the arithmetic and discovered, to their irritation and relief, that every defensive posture the objects had taken had reduced risk. If they had wanted to blind satellites, they would have done so as gently as you switch off a nursery lamp. If they had wanted to scramble our guidance, they would have done it not with derision, but with the kind of kindness that humiliates. They had not. They had merely said no in 10 different dialects of physics, then waited for us to say why. The answer to why took the form of a universal constant braided into the beat, a simple fraction found in the spectra of ionized hydrogen clouds everywhere the universe turns. The fraction repeated with a new spacing, one that matched the glitch we had detected months earlier in a series of deep space transmissions. A rogue transmitter no one could triliterate that had been quietly herding an asteroid out of a resonant path with Earth. The glitch was not ours. It was theirs. The objects had been here longer than our fear, keeping our sky boring so our history could be exciting. We called them Peacekeepers because we needed a noun. They, if they is even accurate, called themselves nothing we could pronounce. Their message, when translated into our poor nouns and proud verbs, was uncomplicated and unacceptable to the parts of us that only trust fists. We monitor young civilizations at thresholds where they are both capable of wonder and catastrophe. We interrupt only to prevent the latter from making the former impossible. We do not rule. We do not colonize. We do not reveal ourselves unless you will soon mistake your reflection for an enemy. In the rooms where suspicion is currency, someone asked, "What's the price?" The lattice replied with a brief flash of histories not ours. Worlds surprised into wisdom by a well-timed, not that. Others extinguished before a guardian could arrive. A handful who rejected all assistance and survived anyway by luck, by grace, by whatever a historian calls the residue of mercy. The near war of the previous day receded from a cliff's edge into a story we would tell in classrooms. The battery crews who had launched missiles were debriefed with hugs instead of hearings. In a coastal hospital, a pilot who had almost written a headline slept for 12 hours, then cried without embarrassment and asked for pancakes. In a Chicago church, a pastor preached that humility is not self-hatred but accurate self-measurement in a universe where awe has seniority. Governments issued joint statements with adjectives arranged like sandbags. Measured, provisional, verifiable, translation. We will try to be brave and not pretend we are not afraid. Universities published open repositories of the patterns, a scavenger hunt for a century of graduate students. Kids drew pictures of shields and nests and taped them to refrigerators next to spelling tests that now seemed like the earliest drafts of a new treaty. Elena stood on a roof at dawn with her father, who had emigrated to a country that had taught him to keep his head down and his receipts handy. He looked up at the large, patient geometry over the gulf and said, in a voice that had argued with history and won, "They came to keep the peace, and we almost taught them a different definition." She wanted to say that humanity had grown that weak, that the same species that invents reasons to hate strangers also invents algebra to talk to them, that we are capable of saying not yet to our worst reflexes. She settled for, "We heard them," and the sky, as if pleased to have been understood, pulsed once, just once, soft as a parent's hand on the back of a child taking a first step. Morning did not arrive with trumpets or treaties. It arrived the way trust always arrives, awkward, incremental, full of small, brave tries that look unimpressive until you realize they are the hinges of history. The UN announced a provisional protocol. No weapons within 100 kilometers of the Peacekeepers' positions, open scientific access to the signal lattice, and a standing channel for non-military transmissions. The phrase "standing channel" felt like an achievement. In bedrooms and break rooms, people cried at nothing in particular and then went to work. A baker in Queens rolled dough as if feeding strangers might impress the sky. A rancher in New Mexico checked fence lines and said to no one, "If they are here to keep the peace, the least we can do is not start a stampede." Elena and the code team pushed a clean-room library to the world, an open parser that turned the pulses into shapes a high school could plot. They named it Lullaby, a nerd's joke about being sung to sleep by Constance. Downloads crushed servers, then normalized as universities mirrored the repo. A teacher in Nairobi printed the spiral on construction paper. Her students traced it with crayons and wrote "hello" beneath with the particular neatness children reserve for sacred first drafts. The first human reply was not in words. It was a map of our own, a soft echo of their pulsar lattice, annotated by tiny perturbations at the frequencies of our coastal tide gauges. The note said, "We understand these rhythms too, we make our homes around them." A minute later, the Atlantic hull pulsed back an overlay, our tides as they would look under a storm arriving in 3 days. The overlay carried a shimmer at the edge, a faint scrim of caution. It was meteorology as apology. The Peacekeepers had not come to steer weather, but they were telling us the wind was on its way. FEMA briefed governors, mayors briefed neighborhoods. For the first time in a week, the news crawls mentioned sandbags more than missiles. When the storm landed, it did so as storms do, messy, cruel to the unprepared, generous to those who had done the boring work. The Peacekeepers did not part the clouds. They held the undersea cables steady as if cupping the throats of our conversations so we could keep talking. The lights flickered and mostly stayed on. The storm had a name that would be forgotten by winter. The decision not to mythologize it was itself a kind of reverence. In Houston, Elena's father stood on their roof again, hands in pockets. "It's strange," he said. "When I was young, power meant a boot. Now it looks like a hand stopping a vase from falling." "Same muscles," Elena said. "Different intent. Across a janitor's closet at the UN. The kind of room where rough drafts of history are mopped and made, delegates practiced saying the new words without choking on the old ones, guardianship without government, intervention without occupation, consent that matters even when you're scared enough to sign anything." A Pacific Islander diplomat, whose nation had learned the arithmetic of sea level by watching graves migrate inland, asked the question that recentered the room. "If they will not rule, then let us not abdicate." Outside, the city tried out new rituals. In Times Square, a brass band from New Orleans played a second line under the patient hull, notes oiled with joy. The ship answered, if answer is the verb for the way light can thicken, by settling its glow into a 4/4 sway that made strangers dance like cousins. In Kyoto, monks tuned their chanting to the Schumann resonances and smiled when their temples' rafters hummed back. In Lagos, the DJ from the earlier block party mounted bigger speakers and told the crowd, "We are not celebrating aliens, We are celebrating learning to listen. The week's memes matured. Sky Roombas ceded the timeline to Sky Aunties, a joke that held tenderness. Someone older, patient, unwilling to let the children set the kitchen on fire. A cartoonist drew a peacekeeper slipping a knife safely out of a toddler's reach and was accused, as cartoonists often are, of both treason and prophecy. Not everyone felt the relief as gift. Some heard humiliation. A talk radio host spat that being saved insults a sovereign nation. A veteran who had buried brothers called in to say survival is not insult. A mother called to say her son sleeps through sirens now. Neither convinced the other. They did, however, keep talking long enough for ads to play for solar panels and anxiety apps, proof that capitalism can metabolize any mood. In a hangar near the coast, the battery crew that had launched the almost shots scrubbed rails and took inventory. Their commander gathered them beneath a fluorescent buzz and said, "We did our job, we were ready. Now the job is to be ready for a different kind of day." A private asked, "What if they change their mind?" The commander looked up through the corrugated roof at a shadow that didn't cast itself and said, "Then we do what we always do. We stand up, we think, and we don't shoot first." At sundown, the Atlantic ship pulsed a pattern so slow and low you felt it more than saw it. The frequencies matched fetal heartbeats and porch swings, and the time it takes a tired person to decide to forgive. The linguist who loved Bach cried again and didn't apologize. The coder recorded the pulse and watched as social media clipped it into lullabies that put toddlers to sleep, then put their parents to sleep on the couch beside them. The most shared clip was captioned, "We pointed guns at angels and they hummed us toward better." No voice yet, no face, just the quiet work of a new morning, us not less fierce, but fierce in service of something other than fear. Eventually, every honeymoon meets a ledger. We asked what we always ask when power arrives without invoices. What do you want? What do we owe? And what happens if we say no? The peacekeepers answered in a tempo that made lawyers happy and pundits furious. Their pulses organized into a document anyone with a ruler could read, a charter in ratios. Alina's team translated it into nouns and clauses. Ambassadors translated it into careful adjectives. Headlines called it the Threshold Compact. Its preamble was brief. We appear at thresholds where your reach exceeds your wisdom by a margin that risks making tomorrow impossible. We remain only long enough to rebalance that margin. Then came the lines that would be argued over like scripture at a family reunion. 1. No weapon whose failure destroys more than it protects will be permitted beyond low orbit. Humanity flinched at the word permitted and then relaxed at the modifier beyond low orbit. The peacekeepers were not coming for our rifles or our honor. They were drawing a chalk line where a miscalculation could spill into forever. 2. Interventions will be negative, not additive. They would remove risk, not add capability. No technology transfers, no miracle fixes. No skipping grades by copying the smart kids' homework. 1,000 R&D heads slumped and then perked up at the challenge. We will have to build our miracles the old-fashioned way, curiosity, stubbornness, and grant proposals. 3. Consent is the first tool. They would not push unless we pushed first toward cataclysm. The charter defined cataclysm precisely enough to matter and vaguely enough to be argued about for decades. Politicians discovered a new toy, voting to define catastrophe. The hearings were loud and sometimes lovely. A Ghanaian jurist who had written about customary law explained that guardianship without domination is possible, but only in communities where shame is rehabilitative, not terminal. Our battery commander, testified that being spared had not emasculated his unit. It had clarified their mission. A biotech CEO demanded the peacekeepers share a cure for glioblastoma. A nurse replied that the point is not that they won't fix everything, but that we should stop pretending survival is a service someone else owes on demand. There were walkouts. There were marches. Placards read, "No custodians without consent," and "No consent without clarity." A union of longshoremen released a statement supporting the compact because we know what happens when cargo goes over your head that you didn't ask for. A think tank warned that dependence can come disguised as kindness. A rabbi, an imam, and a physics teacher walked into a bar and agreed, to the bartender's shock, that gratitude with boundaries is a virtue. Negotiations with the Peacekeepers followed the odd etiquette of talking to the weather. We sent pulses shaped like proposals. They answered with yes/no/clarify, written in shifts of phase and amplitude, as subtle as a raised eyebrow. When a block attempted to sneak a weapons platform through the letter of the orbit clause, the Peacekeepers didn't swat it. They held it in a pocket of air like a butterfly in cupped hands, then set it gently on a trajectory to burn so clean it left no ash to litigate. In classrooms, kids debated the difference between protection and control. Ninth graders did mock compacts with rules about cafeteria line cutting and hallway speed limits. The best clause in a school in Fresno read, "We will not confiscate your hot Cheetos. We will remove only those quantities of Cheetos that, if consumed in the next 5 minutes, would precipitate a trip to the nurse." The teacher gave an and forwarded the joke to Alina, who forwarded it to a diplomat, who read it before standing to address an assembly of very serious people, and smiled for the first time in 3 days. We added our own terms, because partnership without reciprocity is parenting, and the Peacekeepers were clear they had no interest in adoption. Our additions fit on a page but felt like a spine. A right to refusal, we could tell them to stand down and accept the consequences. A right to question, no intervention without an attempt at explanation. And a sunset clause, they would leave when our catastrophic error rate fell beneath a threshold measured not by hope, but by audited data. The Peacekeepers pulsed assent so quickly a congresswoman accused them of sarcasm, then apologized during the recess outside a food truck, where she bought 2 tacos for a janitor who has swept that building for 30 years and knows a tide when he hears one. "It is strange," she told him, "to legislate for the sky." He shrugged. "Ma'am, I just mop, but a floor is a floor." The compact passed, not unanimously, not triumphantly, but with the steady math of democracies that remember compromise is a form of courage. On the day of signature, pens moved under a hull that flickered, just once, in a pattern Alina's team translated as acknowledged. The moment felt less like surrender than like a wedding between grown-ups with prenups, romance disciplined by realism, vows with verbs about dishes and deadlines. Our best negotiator, a woman who had buried a son and learned the grammar of grief the hard way, gave a short speech. "We are not lesser for surviving," she said. "We are only lesser if we outsource the work of becoming who we say we are." Outside, a boy in a blue cap practiced grounders until the sun went down and the field lights came up and the ship above him dimmed, polite enough not to outshine the game. You cannot shake hands with a field. You cannot pose for photos with a geometry. Culture hates a vacuum, so we poured ourselves into the silence and waited to see which parts the sky would echo back. It turned out they had a taste for rhythm and restraint. The first formal exchange took place on a barge off New Orleans, where an orchestra tuned against gulls and diesel, and an air thick enough to chew. The program opened with a Bach partita because the linguist insisted and the conductor trusted women who cried at math. Midway through, as the line of the violin climbed a staircase built out of symmetry, the hull above them softened its glow into a wash that matched the piece's pulse. Not a beat-for-beat imitation, but an affirmation. Musicians do not often gasp on downbeats. That night they did. From there, the invitations multiplied. A Lakota astronomer led a sunrise ceremony on the plains, drumming in a meter older than telescopes. The northern vessel answered with aurora, filaments lowered until the horizon wore green lace. In Seoul, a street dance crew battled beneath the Pacific ship. Their friezes became sculpture, answered by the ship's shadow holding perfectly still as if applauding with stillness. In a church in Atlanta, A gospel choir lifted a chord that once taught marching feet when to move. The hull's light bent around the church's cross without touching it. The pastor called it manners. Schools held windows and mirrors days, windows to see the other, mirrors to see ourselves more accurately. Kids collected stories of human first contacts with ourselves, interstate highways that split neighborhoods, treaties written on paper and broken on purpose, vaccines that turned plagues into history homework. They wrote letters to the Peacekeepers on real paper because someone's grandmother said sincerity has weight. The letters were delivered in bulk via a barge and a crane, and the kind of ceremony a civilization invents when it wants to say, "Thank you," without saying, "Own us." No letter got an individual reply, but a week later the Atlantic hull pulsed a paragraph-length pattern that, when rendered, drew overlapping circles labeled in frequency bands that matched human hearing ranges. The caption Alina's team suggested, captioning the sky had become a profession, was chorus. The Peacekeepers were saying that what we had done on barges and planes and church steps felt, to them, like a species learning to sing with itself before trying harmony with anyone else. Commerce found a way to be tacky and tender at once. T-shirts read, "We come in peace," they came in patient. Etsy sold threshold compact, wedding vows printed on archival paper. A brewery in Portland released a saison called Schumann Resonance that tasted like time and thunder. It won medals. Everything wins medals if you wait long enough. Of course, there were frauds and fads. A cult announced that only its leader could hear the ship speak in words. The leader later admitted he had been hearing his own childhood and apologized on a podcast. A startup promised peacekeeper-grade, noise-canceling headphones and quietly changed the copy after a gentle letter from a lawyer who did not specify for whom she worked. A politician tried to ride the wave by accusing an opponent of being soft on geometry. The opponent posted a video of herself soldering a ham radio kit and ate the accusation for breakfast. In Fresno, the boy who had asked his mom about practice found his team's schedule full of away games because everyone wanted to play on the field with the sky in its outfield. He learned to look up between pitches and then look down in time to keep the ball in front. His coach told him, "Heads on a swivel, heart on your sleeve, hands ready." It was good baseball advice. It was decent statecraft. Elena, exhausted by governance and giddy with relief, composed with the linguist a piece for piano and modulated radio called Nocturne for Pulsar and Porchlight. On the night it premiered on 1,000 rooftops and stoops. The Peacekeepers' lights dimmed to the level of a neighbor sitting quietly on your steps while you talk yourself down from a bad day. The piece ended with a chord unresolved. The ship did not resolve it. The silence after belonged to us. We never saw a face. We learned to live with that. Some mysteries you do not solve. You befriend them until they teach you better questions. The better questions produced better habits. How to disagree without reaching for matches. How to plan beyond a budget cycle. How to hold your applause long enough to hear the softest voice in the back row say, "Wait." The first great test of the compact came not with an enemy fleet, but with the sun. Our star spat a tantrum that would have made the 19th century glow and the 21st choke. The Peacekeepers pulsed a forecast whose confidence interval settled like a hand across the world's forehead. Fever incoming. Their message did not say, "We will save you." It said, "If you will let yourselves be inconvenienced now, you will not be broken later." The prescription was deceptively simple. Downshift the grid, throttle satellites to safe modes. Park transformers in sacrificial alignments you only attempt when you believe in tomorrow. Economies hate breaks. Campaign seasons hate them more. The hearings were brutal in the way all good surgeries are, honest about pain. Grid operators explained cascade failures to legislators who had never thought about inductance. Farmers asked what a day of paused refrigeration means to milk. Parents asked what a day without screens means to sanity. A teenage coder wrote a dashboard that let neighborhoods vote on voluntary load shedding, and watched as peer pressure turned into civic pride. The zip codes with the most Christmas lights in December became the zip codes with the most darkened porches in August. A barber shop in Detroit offered free cuts to anyone who brought a screenshot of their household's downshift hours. People came by the dozens and left clean and laughing in the hot shade. For the first time since we signed, we used the right to question. The Peacekeepers answered with a tutorial, phase by phase, like a parent teaching a child to merge on the freeway. They showed how the magnetosphere would flex. They showed the worst-case ice on the blade and the best-case dew. They did not touch a single switch. They held their palms beneath the table where our mistakes might fall. We did it, not perfectly, not universally, but enough. Power dipped and surged and critically returned. A few satellites became pretty tumbling stars, and funerals were held with full honors for the people whose jobs are to stand where danger proves we are mortal. On the whole, the storm passed through a civilization that had practiced trust the way an athlete practices breath, on purpose until it becomes reflex. In the quiet afterward, transformers hummed like contented animals. Children slept under battery-operated fans. The sky brightened, not in apology, but in the manner of a teacher pleased with a student who finally shows their work. There were attempts to spin the outcome into ideology. Some claimed the Peacekeepers had bullied us into cowardice. Others claimed we had at last joined the Church of Science. The truth was less sexy and more useful. We had learned to be bored at the right time. Boredom, properly chosen, is a virtue that keeps history available for parties instead of postmortems. A month later, a different test arrived with intent. A small, angry faction launched a weapons bus in defiance of the orbital clause, broadcasting slogans about freedom that ignored everyone else's. The Peacekeepers did not swat them from the sky. They wrapped the bus in a slow time that made its batteries age decades in minutes, then peeled it like a clementine and returned the pieces to Earth via parachutes emblazoned with our own national flags. The message required no translation. Your mess, your mop. We prosecuted. We also asked better questions about the loneliness that makes sabotage feel like a sacrament. The answers were local and unglamorous. Jobs, clinics, schools that work, towns where a human has more to live for than a headline. The Peacekeepers did not applaud. They dimmed, as if giving us privacy to talk among ourselves. Elena visited a middle school to explain the compact. She drew spirals and pulses on a whiteboard and told the kids that a constant is a promise the universe keeps even when we forget to. A boy raised his hand and asked if the Peacekeepers love us. Elena thought of her father's roof, of lullabies and storms, of missiles that changed their minds, of tacos and treaties and barbers paying for kilowatts with clippers, of a baseball falling clean into a glove beneath a shadow that had learned our manners. "I don't know," she said. "I know they respect us enough not to lie. I know they want us to get to tomorrow. Love might be a word we earn later." That evening, on the same roof where the story had first set its chair, Elena watched the Atlantic hull rise a little higher. Sunset turned it domestic, a dark thing edged in kitchen light. Her father leaned on the rail. "Leaving?" he asked. "Backing up," she said. "Sunset clause doesn't start the clock until we stop almost doing something stupid 3 years in a row." He chuckled. "So never. Maybe," she smiled, "maybe sooner than we think." Below them, the city did its nightly inventory of kindnesses and crimes. A choir practiced. A couple argued and then softened. A landlord fixed a boiler without being sued first. A teenager texted an apology brave enough to earn forgiveness. History is mostly small repairs. Cathedrals and catastrophes get the ink. The work is the caulk between ordinary bricks. The ship pulsed once, soft, domestic. A porch light flicked twice so you know someone's home. Around the world, other hulls answered with the same courtesy. Then they dimmed to the glow of a neighbor's living room, present, not imposing. The sky had not become ours, but we had begun to belong to it without pretending to own it. We will tell the story to our grandchildren this way, that on a certain week we pointed guns at angels and they pointed us at ourselves. that we learned not to worship guardians and not to despise them, that our species found a way to be dangerous on purpose, dangerous to famine, to flood, to cruelty, to the boredom that breeds meanness. We will say the peacekeepers were misunderstood, and that after, so were we, no longer the animal who always flinches, not yet the saint who never does, but something in between that deserves a long future and knows how to earn it. And when the ships finally lift to where even poets can't follow, they will leave behind what all good teachers leave, not answers but better questions. We will keep a few rituals, a brass band in the square, lullabies in the key of math. We will look up before we reach for switches. We will learn, slowly and together, how not to mistake the first story for the only one. The night the last of them fades, a little league game will run long under expensive lights. A pop fly will go high, ignorant of metaphors. A child will track it with the innocent arrogance of someone who has not yet learned to fear his own hands. He will catch it clean. The bleachers will cheer. Somewhere in the dark that keeps secrets kindly, something old and patient will nod and choose not to meddle and be at peace.